Welcome builders. So today we're going to be talking about MVC or Model View Controller. So what is it? Well, MVC is a design pattern in application development that essentially focuses on the separation of concern between your business logic or your application's logic and the view. And because of that separation, it allows things to be interchanged easily. For example, you can interchange like a new UI. Say the business logic of your application doesn't need to change, but you want to pretty it up. You want to make a brand new interface. You can do that easily with MVC. Or let's say we need the application to look the same, but maybe behave differently. Well, then we might change up the controllers or the model. So conceptually, it's a really cool concept, and it's a very powerful way to build applications. So we're going to go to the board and look at the different components. We'll start there, and then we'll look at an example of how this might be used in the gaming world. Then we're going to hop over to Visual Studio, and we'll take a look at a sample MVC project, and I'll explain how things are laid out. So let's get started. Okay, so we're on the board. You can see we've got 3 boxes. These are basically the different components for MVC. We've got a model, a view, and a controller. And essentially, each of these components are built separately and can be interchanged as needed. So the way a typical flow is going to work is your controller is going to be accepting input from the user. Based on the input it receives from the user, it goes to the model, gets the data, then sends that data to the view to be displayed to the user. Okay, so let's look at another example. So this illustrates the flow of a request in MVC. So you can see down here, this is our user. It's making a request into the controller. The controller then sends the request information over to the model. The model then sends a response back to the controller with the requested data. And the data is then sent on from the controller to the view, and then the view is the response back to the user. So you can see from the user's perspective, they're saying to the application, I need this, XYZ. The controller is then in charge of gathering the data, sending it to the view, and then presenting it back to the user. So when I was first introduced to the concept of MVC, it was explained to me from a gaming perspective, and it's always stuck with me. It made perfect sense, and I got it. And when applying MVC to the web development world, I quickly caught on because I understood the concept from a gaming perspective, which I understood. So to illustrate MVC from a gaming perspective, let's think about a tank game. In this case, we've got an old school Atari game. No flashy graphics. Everything's very simple. But with MVC, I'll show you how things can be reused and then swapped out. So let's go back to our diagram here where we have model view controller. And for our Atari tank game example, we'll think of it like this. The user is literally using a controller to make the request. So they're using the joystick to point which direction they want the tank to move. That input is then sent over to the model. Let's say they want to swivel the tank's cannon, right? Or press the button and they want to fire. Well, that data gets sent on to the model with the tank to see, okay, do we need to rotate the tank's cannon? Do we need to fire a bullet? Things like that. That information then gets passed back to the controller, which in our case wouldn't necessarily be the physical controller. For a video game, that would be the game logic, right? And then that gets passed on to the view, which is going to display the movement of the tank on the screen or the firing of the cannon, things like that. And that gets displayed back to the user. But now, like we said, with MVC, the cool part is that these components can be swapped out. So let's say we like our controller, we like our game logic, we've got our tank model. All of that's good, but we want to kind of spruce up the graphics. That maybe we don't want it to look like an Atari game anymore. We want to upgrade and have it look something a little more modern. Okay? Well, we could essentially go from looking like this to like this without changing our controller or our model. We're simply swapping out the view. So we're going from the simple blocky graphics of the Atari to something more modern like this, but everything's the same. It's still the top-down view. I can still control it the same way. The game logic still works the same way, and the models are still the same because we're still working with tanks in a two-dimensional space. But now we can take it even farther. So imagine we want to even modernize our game even more. So we're going to swap out our view to something like this. Okay, now maybe our controller needs to change a little bit because maybe we have more complexities in the game than just a simple button to fire and a joystick to move. And as we can see now, this is in 3D. So our model is going to have to change slightly. We're going from an X and Y for a two-dimensional game to an X, Y, and Z for 3 dimensions. And then obviously we're swapping out the view to look much more 3D and modern. So if we go back to our diagram, it might look something like this. So we've swapped out our controller, it's something more modern, and we've swapped out our view that is now 3D and much more modern graphics. And our tank, as we said, now has a Z component to it so that it can be represented in 3D space. So conceptually, you can see the power of MVC. Every component is built with a separation from the other components such that they can easily be swapped out. So now that you've been introduced to the concept of MVC, let's hop over to Visual Studio and take a look at an MVC project and how things are laid out for ASP.NET. So the first thing you're going to want to do is go over to github.com/buildsharper and clone the Course 301 repo on your local. Get that pulled down, and again, if you aren't familiar with how to do that, go back to Course 0 and check that out. We have a quick overview of how to clone a Git repo, or we have a course specifically dedicated to Git, and we go into much more detail on how it works. So once you've got that, let's go into Visual Studio. All right, so in Visual Studio, I've got buildsharper.course1 app1 opened up here. And first thing let's look at is the folder structure. So this is pretty much a default MVC project that I've created here. I've just added a few things to illustrate how things would look in practice. So in our controllers folder, we've got the home controller. And again, the controller is going to take that request from the user, talk with the model, get the data, and then send that over to the view so that it can be displayed back to the user. So we've got our controllers, we have our models, we have our drink.cs, we'll take a look at that in a minute. We have a services folder, so this is going to work in conjunction with our models. This is kind of between the services and the models. We have our business logic and our data, okay? And then on our views, we have a home view, which corresponds with our home controller, and we have some shared views as well. So let's run this application and see what it does, and then we'll take a deeper dive into the code and see how things work. Okay, so buildsharper.com cocktails. We can see there's a list of cocktails. We got margarita, a vodka fizz, and a Manhattan. We have the alcohol type, and we have a list of ingredients. Now, each of these drinks is also a link, so I can click on the link and I get a more detailed view of that drink along with instructions on how to make it. So pretty cool. And now I can go back to my listing, and I can dig into a different drink as needed. So that's pretty much all it does. Let's dig into the code and take a look. So we did an overview of our folder structure with an MVC project. All right, so let's start by looking at the controller. So let's go into controllers, home controller, and I can see we've got our drink service that is private to this class. We're instantiating our drink service in the constructor, and now we have two actions. We've got an index and we have a drink action that takes in a GUID ID. Okay, so the way controllers work A controller has a series of actions. So with our home controller, the two actions are the index page, which is going to display that list of drinks, and then the other action it can handle is to look at the detail for one particular drink. And that would be this drink method where we're taking in the ID of one specific drink. Okay? So we can see with the index page, for the listing of all the drinks, we're going to have a variable, drinks, and it's going to talk to the drink service and call get drinks. I then pass those drinks into the view, and that gets returned as my action result. So you can see we're not specifying any kind of specific page that we want to have for the view. We're just saying view with this data, right? So how does it know what view to show? Well, that's all based on the action, which in this case is index. So when I call view, it's now taking this data and finding a view that lines up with index. So to do that, it goes into the views folder. It lines up the folder name with the controller. So in this case, we're in home controller. So it's looking for a home folder in views. And now I can see I have two views inside the home folder, one for index and one for drink. And these line up one-to-one with my actions. The names all have to line up. With MVC projects, it's pretty cool because it does a lot of things for you on the back end. But naming convention is very important, or you'll get a runtime error. So let's take a look at the index.cshtml. So I can see this CSHTML file is going to work with a list of drinks. Okay? That's defined on the first line of our CSHTML. It's the model that this will be working with. We're now doing just a standard display. We are having a header that says cocktails, and here we're creating a table with our header row, and then you can see we're doing a for each. So for each var drink in model. This model is a keyword that points to the instance of this that was passed in. So remember, in our home controller, when we fetched our drinks here, this is getting passed in to the view. That view is what we were just looking at. It's taking in this list of drinks. Now we can iterate through it here with the for each and reference it as model. So for each drink in our list of drinks, we're going to create a table row. So this will display like the drink name, the alcohol type, and the ingredients. Okay, and then we're going to close out our table and we're done. So now that we've looked at the controller and the view, let's hop over and look at our actual drink model. Okay, so all we have for a drink is a GUID, which is going to be the ID, some kind of unique identifier for this drink. It has a name, alcohol type, which is just an enum. So I can look at definition on this and see we just have an enum with the different alcohol types. And this might come in handy if we wanted to have some sort of a filtering where we could filter by alcohol type or search by type. Instead of it being free-form text, these are specific values that we can code against. We have our instructions, which is just a string, and then we have a list of ingredients, which is a list of strings. All right, now that we have our model, let's take a look at our service. So we'll start by looking at the interface. So if you've never worked with interfaces, don't worry. This example is pretty simple, but we actually do have another course dedicated to interfaces, which I encourage you to go check out. We go into more detail on how things work and the concept behind interfaces. But we can see our drink service has two methods. We have getDrinks, which returns a list of drinks, and then getDrink, which is going to get one specific drink by the drink ID, right? Which is that GUID that we specified in our model. this first property, that ID, which is of type GUID. Okay, so if we go into our drink service, so a quick overview. The interface is going to define the methods that our service has. So to start, we have our get drinks, which is going to return the list of drinks. So we create that new list of drinks, and then I'm going to add each drink one by one. So drinks.add, and then a new instance of drink. We start with the margarita and specify all of the properties. Then we add the vodka fizz and the Manhattan. Each of these are added to the drinks list, and then that collection is returned here. And again, these are hard-coded values for the example. In reality, these drinks would probably be coming from another data source. Like maybe you have a REST API out there that serves up the list of drinks, or you have a database where you could connect to that database and pull in from that data source. But for this example, we kept things simple. And now for our single get drink method, you can see we leverage the get drinks method right below. So the first thing we're going to do is get drinks. Now we're saying, give me the drinks where the ID is equal to the drink ID that's being passed in. Then we find the first or default and we return. So that's our model between the drink service and the drink class itself. If I go back into views real quick, we have this shared folder. And in the shared folder, we have this underscore layout.cshtml. This is a shared layout between all views in the application. So this is where we define our HTML header, we have our body, we have our top navigation. All of this is defined here in this layout file. You can see here this render body. This Razor script is a placeholder where it's going to take whatever is in these specific views. For instance, index, this chunk of HTML from this page will then be rendered in our layout here where it says render body. Okay? Everything else around that is common in this layout. So the next thing I want to take a look at is our program CS file. So remember I said there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes with an ASP.NET MVC project. Well, this is where the magic happens. Here is where it actually wires up everything, such as add controllers with views. This is where we're going to our controllers and we're finding that there are corresponding views, such as the home controller has a home view and then views for each action. This is where all of that gets wired up, as well as our routes. So the default route is going to be our controller / action / ID. A controller that's equal to home, and the action is index. That's the assumed route. So if no route is specified, that's what it's going to use in our controller. So if, for example, we just want the root of our website, like website.com / well, there's no route beyond that. So it's going to default to that home index action. Okay? And then we can see there's an optional ID that goes in there. We use this when we wanted to look at the detailed drink, where we pass in the ID. So we had the controller, which was home. The action was not index, it was drink. So home / drink / ID, which is where we were passing in that GUID. Then that route, when it's accepted by the controller, knows, okay, I'm going to the home controller, I'm looking for the drink route, and I'm passing in this GUID as the ID. Okay? So then the controller will intercept that home controller drink with that ID. It then uses that to talk to the drink service to go fetch that one particular drink, which is then passed into the view. The view, since we're on drink, then goes down to home, drink, CSHTML. And we can see the model for this is the single drink that it then displays in this HTML block here, which is then displayed within our layout CSHTML in the render body section. So that'll do it. That's a quick overview of MVC and the model view controller design pattern, such that we're separating our logic from our view. And we illustrated this with the tank game example, right, where we can swap out each component, such as the UI, the controller itself, or as we talked, when we have a more advanced 3D game, we could change our model to have an X, Y, and a Z. Then we took a look at an MVC project in Visual Studio to see how MVC is applied in the ASP.NET world. So now it's time for everybody's favorite segment, homework. So as always, the first task is to clone the repo. Go out to github.com/buildsharper, pull down course 301, clone it on your local, and then run it. Look through the code, just as we did here, and then look at the folder structure with the controllers, the models, the views. Then for the second part of your homework, we're going to expand the functionality of the application. Add a search bar so that the user can then look up a specific drink. For this, you can use the existing home controller and create a new action for the search. Or you can have a new search controller and go from there. It's up to you. And then of course you'll have to go in and modify the view to add the search bar and then have a new view for the search results. Once you've got this done and you're happy with it, check it into GitHub and send us a link. Reach out to us on Twitter @BuildSharper. We'll give you props and a retweet, or if you're struggling and you need some help, you can reach out to us there as well. So that's going to do it for now. We'll see you next time.